so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. So, come on in the room, have a seat. Let's create a nice, warm, welcoming space for our next presenter. I'm very excited to introduce our next presenter. Our next elder, I should say, Peter. I like the way he's ignoring me as I say that to him. So, our next presenter is Dr. Peter D'Adamo, naturopathic doctor. What can I say about Peter D'Adamo? His intellect is off the charts. He's an artist at his core, a philosopher, a best-selling author, a researcher, educator, and now a budding software developer and air-cooled enthusiast. He's considered a world expert in glycobiology. He's a founder of the Institute for Human Individuality. He's a recipient of the AANP 1990 Physician of the Year Award. He's been an adjunct clinical professor at both SCNM and NCNM. He teaches generative medicine and introduction to biochemical individuality here at UVCNM and supervises a specialized clinic shift in personalized medicine. He's the director of the new University of Bridgeport Center of Excellence in Generative Medicine. All for you right now. Please, a warm welcome for Dr. Peter D'Adamo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'd like to thank you all for being here and for the students who asked me to come and present with you today. I've been so inspired by the earlier speakers, and I felt like the invitation that was extended to me was about not necessarily a lecture about what I should teach you about naturopathic medicine, but rather what naturopathic medicine has taught me. And so it's more or less a kind of personal journey / biography. But there's stuff in there that I think is philosophical, and I've had a 30-year career. I'm a second-generation naturopath. I've grown up with it. It's been the singular pursuit of my life, and at the end of 30 years, it's still the most intriguing thing I do in my day. And I think that there's something in it for everybody. And for those of you who are still preparing to do it, I so envy you for the future that lies ahead of you, and the opportunities, and the potential, the possibilities. So, my story goes back to, a long, long time ago in Seattle, Washington, where I was in the class of 1982 at John Bastyr. And then it was called John Bastyr College of Naturopathic Medicine. It's now John Bastyr University. I'm the guy on the far left, second down. And Dr. Pam Snyder is, where are you, Pam? You got like a big afro. Oh yeah, there she is. Like she's the fourth person from the left in the back row. Amazing class by most people's synopsis. Joe Pizzorno, who founded Bastyr, said that it was always, to him, the best class that ever graduated. And it has a lot of leaders in it. Walter Crinian, for instance, the big environmental medicine authority. Pamela, the foundations coordinator and tremendous force for the philosophy of the professor. Bruce Milliman. I mean, there was a lot of people in that class. The interesting thing about the class itself, though, is that probably maybe 80% of that class could not get into Bastyr if it applied for the next incoming year. They were a whole bunch of people, ex-Boeing engineers and people that were harvested out of health food stores, and then we had a smoke jumper come in at the last minute to fill the final seat that we could actually go forward. So it was an interesting, eclectic mix, and I think that's what made it so interesting and made it such an enriching environment. And I think it was really kind of one of the first classes of what I call Naturopathy 2.0, which was the evolution of the profession away from the, well, let me go hang out with an old guy and see what he does, towards this idea that things that we were using had evidence, they had articles, they had understanding, there were mechanisms behind these herbs, there were interactions that were associated with these herbs. And so we were the first class, or part of that generation, that was the first class that really got, like, biochemical. And this is what I use, Leininger's, and we studied lots of biochemistry. I'm sure this will look familiar to a lot of you. It's the Krebs cycle, which I spent years and years memorizing and have only seen 2 metabolic errors that ever required the knowledge of it. Yet it was interesting. And then you see the car I was working on, which was an old Volkswagen. I love to restore old Volkswagens. And I was driving down the road, and the dashboard started smoking. And I looked in the back, and it kind of looked like that. And I had wanted to more or less never look at that part of the car. I'm pretty good with things like engines and stuff, but electrical kind of evaded me. And it became clear that I was going to have to replace what they call the wiring harness, okay? And if you've ever seen an automobile wiring harness, it looks an awful lot like a spinal column. There's just a whole bunch of things in the middle, and then wires come out on both ends. And taking it out of a car is largely the equivalent of pulling out someone's spinal column. You have to go through everything and pull it out. And it looked really, really daunting, especially when I sort of pulled up the wiring diagram, and it looked like that. And it was just, you know how like when your heart just falls to your feet when you realize the sheer extent of what you've got to be doing. And I got started. I realized that, I might as well just get started. So one day I started, and I realized it was pretty rational. The wires were color-coded. They went to various parts of the electrical system that were numbered, and the diagram was numbered. So I could do that, and I could test it to see if I had a short. And probably about 2 or 3 weeks later, I had the car wired. And, it was kind of like looking at the Krebs cycle. It was kind of that same notion of following things from the sort of beginning to the middle to the end. And the reality is that things with a beginning, middle, and end are generally known. So if you can kind of find a wiring harness that fits something, or you have a particularly straightforward biochemical thing, it's known. And as that young generation of naturopathic physicians, we thought it was all known. If we just studied enough biochemistry and learned enough physiology, and we could get these points where we could interact with these things. And I think the profession still kind of works with that meme to this day, that we like the idea of being evidence-based more than we like the idea of being empirical, although there's really room for both when you think about it. They're both equally important. You need to have something you thought about before you can figure out if there's any support for it, or whether it's rational. You have to have, so the fundamental basis of all evidence is somebody's creative process. And you sort of get to that point where you're sort of in that early physician stage, which I came out of when I was, I don't know, maybe the 3rd or 4th year in practice. And it was just this idea that everybody that came in was a walking pathway. Everybody that came in was something I could reduce in some way to be able to make a reasonably good approximation of what it was that they needed. And I was certain about certain things. And, certainty is a kind of an interesting word. To know what absolute, definitive, a fact that is definitely true, or an event that's definitely going to happen. just for a quick question, how many of you will take a board exam sometime next year? So you know how important certainty is, right? If you see on the exam which of the following herbs is a diuretic, and they ask you, and you see taraxacum, you've got to put taraxacum down there. But how certain are you that taraxacum is a diuretic in that situation when you use taraxacum? So we have a pedagogic structure that enforces the idea of being certain about things. And we exist in a world where few things are certain at all. And certainly the person who sits in front of you, the patient, comes in and says, well, this is what I got. How certain are you that what you're going to do is going to be effective? And how certain are you that what they got, that they told you, or what you think that they got based upon what you found out, how certain are you that? But at the time I was a young physician, I was very certain. I had all this evidence to tell me I was so certain. I had the right to be certain about certain things. Like I said before, I was a second-generation physician. This is my dad, James D'Adamo, passed away 2 years ago. And great physician. If you've ever met him, or people who were permanently moved by working with this guy. Very mystical. A searcher his whole life for trying to understand and to grips with things. And he sort of came out of the naturopathic tradition that was the older way, the empirical tradition, right? The idea that you learn things from other people who know things that you don't. And he started out as a chiropractic, but at the time he was in chiropractic school in New York, it was the last year that the New York school that had been started by Benedict Lust granted naturopathic degrees at the same time. So he got the last naturopathic degree from the New York school that Lust had started back at the turn of the century. And he was a great chiropractor. He was a terrific adjuster, except he was a better naturopath and enjoyed naturopathy much more. To the degree that when he was arrested for practicing medicine without a license, because he treated cancer patients with some vitamins, and was arrested by a district attorney in Nassau County who was running for re-election. And if you know anything about Long Island politics, that right before an election, typically attorney generals and the people who are part of the prosecutorial office, they often will do something to get themselves in the news right before the election. So one year they might round up all the fortune tellers, and one year they might round up all the one-armed bandit purveyors. And my father's luck was that year they were rounding up quack charlatan practitioners. And his big crime was that he had treated cancer patients with a couple of vitamins. And he wound up actually going through a process that was very stressful. And wound up actually having his license revoked by the chiropractic profession because it was practicing East Valley medicine. And they were saying, well, you're a chiropractor, you're off now. Now, of course, if you find chiropractors nowadays, they all do that same stuff. They all prescribe herbs and vitamins and stuff, too. So now it's all been kind of much. I had a singularly unpleasant experience of being a paper boy at the time he was arrested, and having to deliver the newspaper, the front story being that my father had been arrested for quackery. Talk about poetic justice. Well, he put himself back together. The chiropractor gave him back his license, and he decided that he didn't want to practice in a place he wasn't wanted. He moved to Toronto, having one of the largest practices in New York, and then proceeded to produce one of the largest practices in Toronto. Because when you're good at something, that's just the end of the story. So that story has a happy ending. I think he was much happier in Toronto, and then later on in later days he moved to Portsmouth and was really happy. And the one thing that he was kind of done a lot of work with was when he was a young doctor, he wasn't making much money. He worked in a lab. And in that lab, they kind of did what they call hemocytometers. You don't know this stuff. But used to, back in the old days, a white blood count was literally a white blood count. You had a piece of glass that was calibrated, and you counted the white blood cells per the grid, and you had a little clicker thing, and there's your white blood count. He did this stuff to make ends meet because he had a young family, one kid and a wife, and he wasn't making any. Matter of fact, his first patient was somebody he ran through his office and gave an adjustment to, only to find out that the person was there to see my grandmother who lived in the office, lived in the apartment above his office. The interesting thing about it was that he was looking at these slides and he thought to himself, why do people respond differently to different foods? And he was looking at the slide of blood and he thought, well, maybe there's something in the blood that makes people respond differently to foods. And the only thing he could think of, because remember this is 1955, was what's the only thing different in blood besides, different levels of hemoglobin and stuff. But the only genetic difference is blood groups, different blood types. So, of course, I thought this was a crazy idea because I went to Bastyr and nobody told me anything about blood groups other than the fact that they screw up transfusions. And I remember sitting down with Ed Madison, who was really one of my mentors. And he said, your father's book is good, but he didn't mention that article that linked blood groups to peptic ulcers. Now, my father had never spent any time in a medical lab. He literally, his method of getting data was to simply blood type 10,000 people and simply observe what they did. Which ones got better when he gave them this, which ones got worse when he gave them that. So, here was this doctor telling me that there was some evidence maybe that could be behind this crazy idea that my father had that I didn't think there was too much to. Right? And I went into the University of Washington library, which at the time there was no PubMed or anything, so if you guys don't know this, some of the old-timers like Jim and Mitch know this stuff. You go pull an article, you had to go into the Index Medicus, which was a huge book, and then go find the article, which, was in the Yugoslavian Journal of Podiatry or something like that. And then you had to go find where the Yugoslavian Journal of Podiatry was, pull the actual volume out, and then kind of find the article. It was really tedious. And I started the process of just kind of starting to unravel or sort of reverse engineer what these blood groups were linked to that had something to do with physiology or something that had to do with pathology. And there was a lot. I mean, there was diseases linked to blood groups, there was physiology linked to blood groups. Whoa, it's a big thing. It's one of the things that's really the most significant thing that people can have. You get the wrong blood and somebody didn't die. It's kind of real straightforward arrangement. So when you then do that, I thought, there's just so much to this. And so I started to write papers. I wrote lots of papers, complicated papers on lectives, papers on physiology, papers on glycobiology, in the Townsend Letter, in the Naturopathic Journal. Almost nobody read these things. Matter of fact, some of the people in the profession I respected the most used to come and tell me, I read your paper, I didn't understand a single thing you said. Okay, this is complicated stuff. Glycobiology is complicated stuff. Back in the 80s, we were basically trying to get a handle on a single gene for this. And here's somebody saying, well, it's not just genes, it's biology, it's glycobiology, it's protein folding, it's all sorts of phenotypic manifestations. So I wrote these articles in a way it was. And that was kind of neat. I was kind of under the radar, doing my crazy thing. And then I wrote a New York Times bestseller. And that was an interesting story. I got interviewed for a magazine called Details. I think it's still there. It's a men's magazine. It had to do with something ridiculous, like what vitamins to take after you need to recover from a rave. That was the interview. Somebody picked up the phone from a publisher and called me up and said, you look like an interesting guy. How'd you like to write a book? And I said, that's great. I got this idea that your blood type is really useful for being able to figure out your diet. And she said, well, we don't want to do anything like that. We just want a book on holistic medicine. I said, I want to write a book on holistic medicine. So that was the end of the phone call. 2 months later, she calls me back up. She said, I was just at a board meeting. We were in books in print. And there's not a single book on anything having to do with your blood type, having to do with anything. And the idea may be kind of cool. So, okay, I said, we'll write the book. And I got a little, it was Houghton Mifflin. I got a little advance for writing the book. And I went to work writing the book. And I was writing the book like I wrote everything else in my life. Tedious, twisted, kind of looking over your shoulder, trying to imagine how your critics are going to respond to it. And every time I would submit something, she would kick it back and she said, we can't sell this. She said, you're writing for your critics. Your critics are not going to buy your book. Write for the people who are going to buy your book. So this went on and on and on, and one day I get a phone call from her, and she says, I just got fired. Houghton Mifflin is going back to doing textbooks, and your project's on hold. I said, okay. She said, on the other hand, I had lunch with a woman, and I've been trying to tell you that you should get an agent because I feel uncomfortable talking directly to you because I always supposed to talk to an agent. You never got an agent. I didn't So I pick up the phone, I talk to the agent. Okay, she's going to get, 15% lower. And she said, well, you got to get a co-writer, she said, because you've never written a book before, and publishers like co-writers, especially ones who have a background in writing mass market books. It makes them feel more comfortable. Okay, what's that going to cost me? He goes, well, she takes about 35% of the whole thing. I said, wait a minute, I lost my contract, I got this tiny advance, I have nothing, and already you're figuring out how to carve that out. She says, no. She says, we'll take care of everything. So the co-writer sits down with me, her name is Catherine Whitney, brilliant woman, and we start actually re-engineering the book. And all of a sudden, what I wrote is the back becomes the front, the story becomes this, everything is changed. She puts her name on it, a proposal goes out, and the next thing I know is there's 30 publishers who want to bid on this. And they were bidding on it, and they were all calling me up on the phone saying, tell us about the book and blah, blah, blah. So there was one day I was just on the phone all day talking to different publishers, and eventually the price got up very high and was bought by then G.P. Putnam. It's now Putnam Penguin. And then that became the beginning of my odyssey. Interesting thing, when people give you a lot of money to write a book in advance, they're kind of stuck with you. Because now they got to market the book, and now they got to do all this other stuff, but they just threw all that money at you. Okay? So everything changed. All of a sudden I was going to regional bookseller things and talking to everybody else, and media and everything, and then the book came out. And it sold terrible. It sold terrible, and they had thought, oh, this is going to make a killing on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And it never sold anywhere, and everybody was panicking, and then all of a sudden it started selling in the Midwest. And then they were tracking it, and they were saying that there were people getting up on pulpits and saying, buy this book. There were people getting in, like, Shriners and Mason Hall saying, get this book. So the whole thing kind of went the other way. And then all of a sudden the Coast actually kicked in. And this book, which is, maybe you read it, it's got a rather large footprint. Sold. Let me give you an idea of how many copies this book sold. That's a picture of the Cotton Bowl, which holds exactly 100,000 people. Okay? That book sold that. Almost 8 million copies in hardcover. Okay? It got printed in that many languages. Let me describe the years 1996 to 2002 to you. It looked like that. All I ever did was get on airplanes, do interviews, radio shows. It just was never ending. And yet, at the end of it, I had a very funny feeling. I was still a young doctor. What was my future going to be? Just to simply do this again and again? It didn't even need me to do it. The interesting thing is that this book came out at the rise of the internet. It was one of the first websites that had a bulletin board. The community of people who follow this diet to this day self-organize on their own. They have their own. You cannot write a criticism of this book and have an effect on this group. They're inoculated against it. They've either benefited from it, they believe in it, they've understood it, they've studied it for 10 years. You can go on the forums for these blood types. The moderators are there for 10, 15 years. The lead moderator in my website is a guy from Turkey. There's another one from California. There's another one from Australia. They do it for free. You can't engineer that. You can't buy it. You can't hire it. But still, I kind of thought, I'm kind of young. I don't want to close the book on my creative process with that. It's super. I mean, it put my kids through school. It did all sorts of wonderful things I'm very eternally grateful for. It also showed me another side of human nature that I won't address. So, I was looking for more and more ideas. I was looking and applying. I was searching for, sort of a certain level of precision in my life, And I started thinking about epigenetics at this point. This would have been about 2007. And this is about the quickest explanation of epigenetics I can give you. Genotype rolls down a ball. The ball goes down various valleys. The various valleys are the various ways you can have a phenotype. Okay, that's called an epigenetic landscape. The process is called canalization. So genotype is canalized into phenotype by rolling down different valleys, and those valleys could be environmental factors, they could be phenotypic manifestations of other genes. Anything can cause those. The thing that's kind of unique about this model by this guy named Waddington is, of course, once you have a certain level of phenotype rolling down a valley, you can't really pick the ball up and take it in another valley. So each valley kind of constricts into a smaller and smaller valley. And out of it comes a phenotype manifestation, but it's a representation of the blueprint, that's the gene, but also the effects of the environment. And I looked at how blood type had a possible influence on epigenetics, and it had a big influence on epigenetics. It turns out that one of the major reasons you have a blood type is not to confuse, complicate transfusion. It controls a lot of what Dr. Stargrove was saying with regard to gastrulation and all the various developmental aspects, morphogenesis and things like that. So blood groups are very linked to the morphogenic process, developmental physiology, and that's why when you get cancer and stuff, when you go back to being an embryonic piece of junk, you start manifesting really weird blood type antigens because it's all linked together. We know that one of the reasons you have a blood type is it runs ahead of things. Like you sprinkle blood type when you really want a blood vessel over there. You know, like a surveyor would go ahead of a highway and say, we're going to put the rest stop here, we're going to put the overpass there. Well, blood type antigens actually seem to have this effect developmentally. They act as a seeding possibility kind of thing. Why there are 4 of them, you know, your guess is as good as mine. So I wrote a book in 2007 which kind of explains how you can get further into this idea of more and more precision. Genotype diet. You can see there I've got lines drawn to weird things like legs and blood groups because that's a type of statistics called principal components analysis. And you can link phenotypic traits through this by how they aggregate. Okay? Long story, I'm not going to bore you with it. And these genotypes then became the basis of the second set. So it really was a weird thing. A diet guy, me, wrote a book which wasn't the continuation of the first book. And that caused a lot of consternation in my community, which is like, wait a minute, you're telling me that And I said, well, you know, the blood type diet works terrific in about 80% of the people. But if you need further refinement, this might be a better way of doing it. And we use this one more clinically, because it's more clinical. Now, I was saying something about the observation that I had. You know, the interesting thing, we're in a small profession. And we're a small profession numerically, and to a certain degree, we're in a small profession in terms of our numeric worldview. As I said before, there's 7 million people, maybe 8 million people who bought that book. And we did some outcome studies on about 7,000 of them, and it turns out that if you take the basic chocolate, strawberry, vanilla blood type diet, about 8 out of 10 people are happy with it. In other words, they got what they wanted. Okay? So what does that mean when you have 7 million people? It means there were 1.4 million people walking around saying that it didn't work for them. So I get a kick when a naturopath says, or a doctor who says, you know, I had a patient, but he told me it didn't work. I said, that's a pretty common occurrence. When you got 1.5 million people out of 7 with a success rate of 80%, you're going to bump into somebody where it didn't work. So sometimes I think we tend to get a little away from the real probabilities and the real numbers. And I don't think any of you have really ever, certainly I never before this, dealt with these kind of numbers. Millions. Okay? And who knows how many people read the book. That's just the people bought it. So again, I kept looking for precision. I wrote this book, The Genotype Diet 6 Variations. But what happens when you start putting in other genes and stuff? Things start to get more complicated. How do you write a book that's got 23 variations? Do you send Joe Schmo to chapter 22 and Jane Doe to chapter 16? What if you got 100 variations? Do you have 100 chapters, each one for everybody? So actually, I ran out of the book as a way of getting thoughts across to people. And I started writing software. Because I was watching Harry Potter with my kid. And at one point, this book starts to write itself. And I thought to myself, I want to write a program that makes a book that writes itself. You know, rather than you go buy a book, go to chapter 3, let the entire book written for you. From the beginning, middle, and end. So, if you've been at the COE, you know we use this program Swami, we take measurements and all sorts of things. And you hit a button and out comes this diet, and mathematically the chances of this diet repeating are 1 in 10 million or 12 million. So they're very specific diets. And then I started writing more software. I wrote a program called Quadlibet that does molecular modeling. Now that to you might look like a pathway chart, like any other pathway chart. But this chart is actually depicting underlying data. It's not a JPEG. It's not a GIF file. It's actually being made dynamically. And as we add things to it, the chart rearranges. For instance, the colors change based upon the location in the network of the node. If the node is centralized, it gets more gold color. If the node has more important friends, the border changes color. If you add a new gene, everything changes again. If you click on the green things, it goes to a lookup that tells you naturopathic things that are associated with the expression of that protein. If you click on other stuff, it tells you about the gene itself. I had a lot of fun writing this program, not simply to depict data, but because of what the data were later beyond able to do and go on to do. I started writing programs that did what's called cladistics. In this case, this is a dendrogram of the clinically significant forms of probiotics. I just kept doing stuff. I was looking for more and more, some sort of precision. I could see all this knowledge, and I could see this need for it, and I could see this way to harvest it, and some way to make sense to me out of it. If you took every gene I've actually ever followed since I started writing it, it looks like this. Okay, and the ones that are more important are bigger, and the ones that are less important are smaller. But those are currently every gene that gets included in some calculation someplace, in some piece of software that I do in the clinic over there. Okay? I started writing programs that took naturopathic agents and generated what I call molecular logos. If you look at a naturopathic agent, you could look at what it works on and generate a logo, just like a corporate logo for that thing. So you could click on, I don't know, Artemisia, Scutellariae, berberine, hit a button, and it would give you the logo molecularly in terms of the targets and the pathways and the agents, so that we could use our substances with that much more insight. And it get more and more complicated. By the time I started adding what's called the PPIs, PPI is abbreviation for protein-protein interactions. So these are the proteins that are generated by the gene that interact with the proteins that are generated by other genes and other proteins that are generated by other genes. And it starts getting more and more and more complicated. So this is a map of the same cube, the same sphere, but with the protein, one layer of protein-protein interactions added to it. And it gets 100 times more complicated. So when we think about a gene, we think with certainty that this gene is going to do this. And when we think about the reality, that gene is going to code some protein, that protein is going to develop some form of glycosylation, they're going to phenotypically have a function. That function may well be to impact the structure function of another gene, or to go on and do something else 3 or 4 levels downstream that may have an effect. It gets crazy. This was very distressing. Because I could learn a lot. But, a lot of something is still a lot of something. A lot of this is still a lot of this. A lot of this is still a lot of that. But it gets worse. Things are stochastic in this world. You know what that means? Stochastic is like a fancy word for kind of random, but not really chaos. In other words, something that's banging around this perimeter, but I don't know where it's banging. All right? The word comes from a Greek word, which is kind of a shortcut for, how you can aim an arrow, but you can't get it exactly where you want to go. It's going to be close. Almost everything in a living system is inherently stochastic. Okay? Everything is changing values at any given moment. Everything is adapting. Everything is responding. Everything's interacting with the environment. Everything's interacting with the control systems in the nucleus if you're talking about a cell. And you've got communication going through the cells, into the cytosome, out to the cell membrane, back into the nuclear factors, release. Now you've got transcription factors activated, gene regulatory sequences, all sorts of other things going on. And it's all banging around in there, and it's all stochastic. Okay? And stochastic is not hard to understand if you just think about one thing. Heat. Heat is the single biggest stochastic influence on the cell. The second biggest is viscosity. The two biggest things that influence how anything works in a cell is how hot it is and how gummy it is. Okay? You take a transcription factor from the nucleus that has to go out to a tyrosine kinase on the membrane. In a high viscosity environment and in a non-high viscosity environment, that transcription factor might take 4 minutes. In a high viscosity environment, it might take 14 hours. Just by viscosity. If the cell gets too hot, what happens to proteins when you heat them up? They turn into scrambled eggs. Proteins don't like to get hot. So when the cell starts to get hot, proteins start to change shape, they start to change function, and again. So two of the simplest, most basic things in life are the two biggest regulators of uncertainty elements inside the cell, any given moment. And what are those stochastic types of things? People get old, they might be more viscous to cells. Maybe they don't drink a lot of water. Maybe their cell membranes are not particularly healthy. Maybe they're not thick. Maybe they're not waxy enough. Maybe there's not a lot of membrane movement of things. What's the second thing that you worry about beyond the complexity is entropy. Entropy is the simple act of everything going to hell. Okay? In a structured way. If you come back to this room 10,000 years from now, the ceiling is going to be on the floor. The chandeliers are going to be crashed. There may not even be a floor. This floor may be down in the basement. Because everything inherently goes from a state of order to an increase in disorder. Okay? It's how the universe cleans itself. Okay? It's how the universe deals with things. There's only a couple of things that ever get to beat entropy. And depending upon your take on things, some people say the creation. The Big Bang was one of the only instances of absolute anti-entropy, what they call neg-entropy. The only other thing that beats entropy is life. Life is the only thing that runs backwards to entropy. Everything in life is ordered, right? You make mitochondria, they have cystae. You have, magnesium on the outside and taurine on the inside, and everything is structured. But the cell, life cheats to beat entropy. Because it doesn't really beat entropy in any sort of way that's fair. It beats entropy by creating negative entropy. It makes puddles where there's low entropy, and it exports that entropy someplace else. Okay? Just like a town, right? If you lived in a city, before long it'd be covered with garbage. But what does the city do? It puts it in a landfill or it puts it in a scow and sends it out to sea. So the city continues to fight entropy by simply exporting its entropy. Well, entropy is just one of those interesting things because entropy has a lot to do with certainty. But not the certainty that you and I know. Okay? When you take a piece of information, let's say I tell you that 2 + 2 = 4, you say that as context. Okay? Cells don't have context. Cells only have certainty or uncertainty. And information in a cell only does one thing. It removes uncertainty. And cells, just like people, don't want to be uncertain. So cells process information, and the information removes uncertainty, and that allows them to be entropy. Now, the interesting thing about information is just how cool it is when it comes to entropy. For instance, if I said to you, The inside of my forehead is purple. Knowing that fact, does that make you weigh anymore? Does that make you sweat anymore? Does that make the hair on your arms get all one, Information doesn't have a matter-energy manifestation. A system can go from my information alone, and it doesn't have to deal with entropy. Entropy is just so basic that it's been called the arrow of time. If you want to know where time is, just go look where the entropy is, and there's where time is. Time and entropy are linked together. I think Mitch had made reference to the idea of determinism and non-determinism. This is another one of those wicked problems. When we say taraxacum is good for bladder infections, we are making a series of logical assumptions. We're making the assumption that, like this hiker, if I go to this next tree, I can go from that tree, I can then go to the next tree, and then from that tree I can go to the next tree, and from that tree I can go to the next tree. That is called a linear deterministic worldview, a linear deterministic model. Okay? We live by these things. The world is nonlinear, non-deterministic. In essence, when you get to the first tree, the forest rearranges itself. Okay? That's one of the problems with living systems, is that you can't get very far in your assumptions because of entropy and stochastic behavior and things like that. You can't think too far ahead. Now let's look at another one of our issues with regards to basically things that make us far more certain than we think we are. Nature doesn't like a bell-shaped curve. Everything that we learn about how we make judgments is based upon Gaussian distributions, right? The classic standard deviation is Gaussian. The classic idea that something reaches a point where we are safe making a conclusion about it is Gaussian. But pathways and isolated observances are Gaussian, but nature uses networks and hubs. Nature doesn't use pathways and single observances. Nature uses hubs, what are called power laws, and preferential behaviors. I'll give you a basic example. This is a road map of the United States. If I needed to go from, New York to Cincinnati, Rick's hometown, I get on the highway and I drive from New York to Cincinnati. Okay? This is how you got taught biochemistry. This is how I got taught biochemistry. This goes to that goes to this, and so on and so on. And this is how you drive the country. It looks an awful lot like my Volkswagen. Let me tell you about the way nature is. Nature is an airline map. Okay? Nature doesn't go to Fort Wayne through Cincinnati. Nature doesn't go from Dallas through Newark. Okay? Airlines would be out of business if they did that. So what do? They send, if I need to go to Fort Collins, they don't give me a direct flight to Fort Collins. They say, well, we'll send you to Denver, and then you can pick up a little jumper there. Okay? What is that called? A hub. So when I say that you have hubs in networks and you have preferences, attachments in networks, you're really talking about how information in networks accumulates added value, how that information becomes important. And so when you look at pathway maps, you have to realize that you're looking at a representation of my Volkswagen electrical circuit, and that's not going to basically help you very much in terms of coming to grips with how things are doing. We are limited beings in a world we try to understand is complex. All right? None of us have the capacity to do what needs to be done with all this data. It just isn't there. We weren't built for that. And complex systems are messy. And human beings make errors trying to understand them. Who would disagree with that? Right? You guys are right in the midst of coming to grips with messy things and difficulties and errors trying to understand them. It's just the way it is. That's okay. The problem is how to build a philosophical worldview based on these two themes. So let me read out what the two themes are. The world is a complex mess, and we are limited beings. So, what do you think about invisible world? When you're in a clinic shift at the UV, we used to give a questionnaire that said, amongst other things, how do you rate your appreciation of the invisible world? You get the most interesting answers. But if there's an invisible world, there's an appreciation of what's invisible and what's not. And what's invisible is obviously something that we aren't conceptually able to see or understand or touch or feel. And hold on to that for a second. There's some hope. You know, systems are complex and chaotic, but nonetheless they're ordered and robust. I mean, they wouldn't have got there if they didn't do something awfully well. So, in the midst of all that complexity and seeming chaos, stochasticity, and entropy, and powerlessness, and all the things that give us trouble when it comes to understanding, they do behave in ordered ways and they are robust. You know, this show, this entire PowerPoint, so a lot of slides, most of them don't really do anything, but there's not a single bullet point in the entire lecture. And I think I've given up on bullet points. I think there's something about them that, I don't know, I'm not getting bullet points anymore. Humans and organisms are engineered to be error tolerable, still reliable. Like Mitch said, we want people to be able to bounce off the floor. We don't want to have to provide a mattress. We want to be able to get the bounce. And the one thing you can count on in these systems is that they learn and they re-engineer and they do better. You know, there's different types of network behavior. Let's say you look at a network that's like the power grid, right? When you get a substation in Albany that goes out, everybody loses power, right? Because it all just trickles down. But what happens when you lose your connection to the internet? I'm not talking about your wireless. I'm talking about the connection to the internet that's coming from your IP. You never notice. Because the second you lose the connection to the IP, another router in Staten Island picks you up. You don't even notice that. So what's the difference? Electrical system is fragile. Internet is robust. What's the definition? In the middle lies perturbation, disruption. So robust systems can be perturbed, and they respond in a resilient manner. Fragile systems can't respond in a resilient manner to perturbation and disruption. I don't have a slide for this, but I used to be fond of showing it. If you go to KEGG, which is the Kyoto Encyclopedia of Genes and Genomics, and look up the definition of disease, it's defined as a perturbation of the molecular system. And KEGG defines drugs as a perturbant of the molecular system. You want to get that again? A disease is a perturbation of the molecular system. A drug is a perturbant of the molecular system. So you are, in allopathic drug therapy, treating a perturbed system with a further perturbant. Okay? It's an interesting thing. It's kind of like expecting to hit a billiard ball in the pocket, but hitting your opponent in the eye instead and knocking him out to the hospital. You technically won the game, okay? But you didn't do it the right way. Instead, our goal is not necessarily to perturb a system to the point it becomes further perturbed. Our goal is not to eliminate the error. The goal is to develop ways to recognize the error and metabolize it. Now, again, this is kind of an oversimplification, but the complexity of most medical problems is massive and intimidating. Okay? When you get in a room by yourself with a patient, and you really think long and hard, you could like pass out. Because somebody's trusting you with something that anybody who really knew you would never give you. It's the truth. I mean, if people trust me with their life, I wouldn't even trust me with my life. So it's very complex work, and we have to make a lot of assumptions about the nature of what we are. You know, I'm the doctor here, also at the South Florida. It's like, what are they kidding me? You know, kind of like go back in the closet and, like, you know, stifle a gasp. But the complexity of most medical problems is massive, and we can't solve them exactly. You can't solve a thing in a person. But we can make simplifications, some simplifications, and look at how they behave qualitatively. This is where all of a sudden this shift goes from the depressing part of the lecture to the slightly more hopeful part of the lecture. Towards the philosophy of naturopathic generative medicine. In order to have a generative medicine, you need a couple of things. They're not much and they're not hard to understand, although sometimes they're so simple that smart people have trouble with them. For instance, when I was in geometry class, I went the entire year not knowing that the word adjacent meant next to. Now try to take a geometry class and not know what the word adjacent was. I was too scared and too inhibited to say, what does this word mean? This magical word adjacent, what does it mean? Now somebody would have said, you dumbass, it just means next to something. So this is why I'm cautioning you, because when you get involved in things like heuristics and models, everybody starts going, ooh, that's really hard. And this is just so simple. It's so simple that that's the problem for a lot of people. So we need robust models in order to be generative. It would be nice if we had a meta-heuristic. Have you ever heard of that word? It's one of the coolest words I've come up against in recent years. Okay? You'll see what it means. It's just a cool word. Anytime you're in academia, you know, I'm working with these heuristics here, and, you know, everybody goes, whoa, heuristics. But the reality is that, as you'll see, it's an awful lot like adjacent. Let's get started with some basic things. This I did not invent. This comes from the textbook of systems biology. There are no pathways, only networks. Okay? So you might use a pathway like somebody might drive from New York to Norwalk, but you ought not to use it for much more than that. Pathway model is reductionist. It's unrealistic. It doesn't take into account the flow of information. And remember, cells like information. And they work, networks work like computers, and cells work like networks. Okay? We used to run this thought experiment in one of my classes. I would say, you over there, you have a light switch. 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 When they throw their light switch on, you turn yours off. When this is on and this is off, you turn yours on. When that's on and that's on and that's off, you turn yours on. And so on and so forth. And you start to realize that all of that conditionality is a living network of information processing about the environment. Okay? And it's live, and it's resolving uncertainty, and it's beating entropy, and it's computing. Okay? That's why a cell can go like an E. coli, right? They take a bunch of sugar, you throw it around, the E. coli makes what's called a pellet fimbriae, right? And it beats itself towards the sugar. Okay? Wonderful system. All of a sudden, there's no sugar. You know what the E. coli does? It turns off the gene for the whipping flagella and turns on the gene for this twisted tumbler flagella, and the cell just jumps around for a while. Because it doesn't make a difference where it goes because there's no sugar anyway. So I might as well just throw the dice and see where I land. Networks think, learn, and respond. So we talk about this, a robust network. What's a robust model? A robust model is nothing more than how much you believe in what it is you're seeing. The more robust the model, the more useful it is. For instance, I could believe that I have an apple in front of me if I bite it, and it tastes like what I associate an apple to taste like. I could even listen to my wife bite the apple and go, gee, that sounds like somebody eating an apple. I could test all the various ways in my worldview that apple fits what it is that I think an apple is. And the more I get, the more I'm convinced that I've got an apple. So a way that we could look at models is that the more we can detect things in multiple ways, the more that are there. And a good model is tested in multiple ways. Here's the word I was telling you about, adjacent. A heuristic is an experienced technique for problem solving. That's all it is. So you got a model and you got a heuristic. It's a problem-solving technique and discovery that finds a solution that's not guaranteed to be optimal. It's just good enough. Okay? So there's nothing about a heuristic that ever actually gives you a darn good answer. It just is good enough to get the job done. You use them all day long. A concept is so basic and simple, smart people struggle to understand its meaning. And if you've ever listened to an aphorism, that's a heuristic. If you've ever listened to a rule of thumb, that's a heuristic. If you've ever used common sense, that's a heuristic. An educated guess is a heuristic. Intuitive judgment is a heuristic. So what we have is a darn good model, an apple we can taste, we can touch, we can hear, we can smell, and we have something that says, under certain circumstances, that could be an apple. Simple heuristics. There are a million of them. Trial and error. What's the most common trial and error I do? I try to fit a nut to a screw in my workshop. So what's the model? Lots of nuts. Right? It's like I got all different sized nuts, and okay. Well, that's the heuristic. Eventually, if I keep trying enough nuts, I'm going to get one that fits. Right? What's the model? All the different sized nuts. What's a good model? Lots of different sized nuts. Who hasn't looked at a problem by drawing a picture of it? Who has said, if you don't succeed, try again? What's so good about that phrase? It doesn't work all the time. Sometimes trying again is the worst thing you can do. Right? You get to a certain point, you should say, this doesn't work. But maybe 90% of the times, that's a darn good rule. If you first don't succeed, try again. It doesn't mean do the same thing again. It just means try something else. But if at a certain point you keep trying to fly, and I try again, it ain't going to happen. So it's not, a heuristic is something that's good enough. Most of the time they get the job done. It ain't perfect. It was never designed to be perfect. It was designed to be imperfect. And your model wasn't designed to be perfect. It was just designed to be good enough, robust enough. Sometimes you get what's called meta-heuristics. These are just things that overlie the heuristic. And they're usually some kind of description of the state space. So my meta-heuristic of my nut and screw example would be all the possible nuts that I have that I can try to fit my screw to. Okay? Not for nothing, meta-heuristics almost always look at a state space, which is the set of all the possible values. You know who uses meta-heuristics? Netflix, when they decide what movie to feed you next. You go to this website where you say, it says, name your kid. It doesn't say, here's a name for your kid. You know what it says? It says, think of a name for your kid. And then you put the name of your kid in that you like, and it says, well, people who like that, you might like this, and this. Okay? So, in essence, meta-heuristics are really just describing this possible variance in the state space. For instance, like I say on the bottom there, if the average temperature in Bridgeport is -5 to 105 degrees, it's probably not necessary to bring snowshoes in your car trunk. All right, we know that that's going to be unlikely given the meta state of the model. Requisite variety. This is, Mitch talked about cybernetics. This is a very interesting concept. And this is where the heuristics actually get clinical. So finally there's going to be some payoff, right, for you guys. Requisite variety, it's a little bit easy it's hard to describe, but easy to make an example out of. If I have a four-way street, I have a traffic light that's designed to be red when the traffic comes from this direction, then it switches to green and it goes back and forth. I have requisite variety, meaning that my controls are varied enough that they're greater or equal to that which I want to control. Now let's say the town decides it wants to put a diagonal path through that intersection. What happens to my traffic light system? It doesn't work anymore because my traffic light system does not have requisite variety to control the variables of the situation. Okay? Requisite variety is an interesting take on ways we look at things. Because we never look at our therapies necessarily when we use a lot of polypharmacy. We don't necessarily ask ourselves, are we failing requisite variety when we do the polypharmacy? But I'll give you an example of polypharmacy that passes requisite variety, and it was the revolution in HIV. Okay? I'm old enough to remember when they died of HIV, they got AZT, and then that didn't work, they got DDI, and then that didn't work, and they got ribavirin, and then that didn't work, and then they got DDC, and then they died. Okay? And then Lee over at NYU said, well, we just taken this virus to school. Why don't we do low doses of combinations of those things? And the logic was that you can't mutate the three things simultaneously. Nothing, even a virus can't mutate the three things or four things simultaneously. And that's why people with HIV walk the planet at this point. Because that combination of... Now, up until that point, when I was a doctor, polypharmacy was like, you did this. You know, no one did use polypharmacy. It was bad medicine. But requisite variety had become possible with that combination to control more variation than there was in variation in the problem. And there's many, many examples of this. Why do you want to look for heuristics? The simple reason is because it's okay to not be precise. It's okay to be inexact as long as you structure it in such a way so that something happens. And remember, I did all that work to be precise. So I have to tell you that being precise is a lot of work, and certainly everything I did up until that point was worthwhile. It helped make better models. But it wasn't the solution set. There was no solution in all that stuff I shared with you. That was all that hard work. And if you give up the search, you can have a much deeper understanding how things work. I venture to say that generativism and the vis lie in this swirl of things. Why? Because, well, we'll get to that now. This is kind of like the drawing. I don't know if you start at the top or the bottom. Because sometimes I think I start at the top, but then again I come to the conclusion that you should kind of nibble in both directions, back and forth. The model is going to have behavior, or it's going to have structure, it's going to have something that it does or something that it is. And that could be little tiny things like Mitch was talking about that involve things like self-organization or control. If it's structure, it's going to have control. If it's self-organization, it's going to have behavior. And then you get higher up the food chain, where the little things acting in simple ways are controlling and producing larger unanticipated actions. That's called emergence. Okay? So emergence is what happens when little things acting in complex ways generate behaviors you don't know anything about. Okay, they may generate an organ. A cell may coalesce into a liver or parenchyma. There's two types of emergence, if you're interested. There's called weak emergence, which is how this happens. And then there's strong emergence, which is most people debate except for one thing. And in strong emergence, there's only one completely deniable evidence of strong emergence, and that's consciousness. That's what? Consciousness. What? Consciousness. Anyway, consciousness is an example of strong emergence because, like T.H. Huxley said in 1947, I just refuse to believe that my thoughts are the result of irritating my neurons. And reality is that it is true. I mean, on one hand, you have neurons, and they like to be certain, so they fire and they do their thinking. But consciousness is a big deal. And when you have consciousness, very close to strong emergence is very close to magic in most scientists' eyes. Weak emergence happens all day long. Anytime you look at things that basically self-organize, there's a degree of weak. Or anytime you look at a termite mound or a bunch of birds flocking or anything like that. So anyway, you have the structure, you have the behavior, you have the control, and then a little bit down you have the emergence and you have hierarchy, and then you have our little meta-heuristic, which is the probability space, the heuristic, which is the rule of thumb, and the working heuristic, which often, if you're lucky enough to get it right, you get something to do. The payoff is you get something out of it. And I think I was a little confused about top and bottom because of this slide. Bottom-up approach is best. And the reality is that you have to nibble the problem from both ends, because often, I was talking to Dr. Snyder, and I said, the interesting thing about writing computer code is it's a lot like making a piece of cauliflower. You start with a stalk, and then eventually you wind up with a floret. And the floret oftentimes then says, well, this is really what I need in a stalk. And back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. So you can keep working heuristics and models and just massaging and getting them better and better. You ever see this notion of wisdom to information and facts? Forget about measurements and facts. Start with data. Data goes to information, information goes to knowledge, and knowledge goes to wisdom. Okay? You guys are getting fed a lot of data, you're getting fed a lot of information, and one of these days, hopefully, you're going to make some knowledge, and then eventually you're going to get wise. Okay? You're not going to get wise from the information, and you're not going to get wise from the data. You're going to get wise from the heuristics you generate out of experience and out of creativity. The interesting thing about this is when I think back on this, at my best, I had done this all along in my career as a naturopathic doctor. For instance, go back to what I talked about in the beginning, patient's ABO type. It's a pretty simple heuristic. If you get the person's ABO type, you can kind of point them in different directions. If you argue the fact that maybe it's good for diet, you can point them in terms of their stress chemistry. You can point them in terms of their biome. You can point them in terms of certain elements in terms of the chemistry of their stress response. There's a huge amount of data on physiology of blood groups and pathology of blood groups that have nothing to do with transfusion. So it's a very robust model. And what's the other advantage of blood types? It's cheap as all hell. A person can go give blood. I think one of the nicest things about that book I wrote is it put the most worried well hypochondriacal people in the hands of the Red Cross. Okay? Who are the perfect people to give blood. Worried well people make the best blood donors. So rather than, people, where do I get my money for this? And it's like all these other kind of things. This was a great thing. So it was a heuristic that worked on a lot of levels. But getting a person's blood type is quick, even if they tested it, it's $10. And you can learn so much with that simple one thing. So I had looked, or my father rather, had looked at heuristics early on. Uh-oh. Hold on, second gears off. Gotta get my battery going here. What? Yeah. I need to self-organize my information here. Let's see what happens. Okay. Like I said before, I had thought of a few more I thought I would share with you. They should come up with pipeline. But you can have fun with heuristics all the time. And if you hang around doctors who are wise, they're full of these darn things. Okay, you hang around with John Van Zier, he's full of heuristics. Yeah, you look at somebody and go, you can't drink beer. And, I can drink beer. And then he would look at us and go, read Nat-Stolf, read Metarinum, read Nat-Mura, come back. I mean, wise doctors are they're heuristically driven because they're always massaging the model, and they're always adjusting the state space, and they're always adjusting the solution. Here's another one. This one's easy. If you ever see a patient on steroids, you should treat them for protein misfolding and aberrant glycosylation. Why? Because steroids blunt the endoplasmic reticulum stress response, which comes from protein misfolding, which is the result of aberrant glycosylation. That's all steroids do. And so with the folded protein response and the endoplasmic reticulum stress response, the cell goes through a death cycle, and out comes ulcerative colitis, or out comes rheumatoid arthritis. So reversing the heuristic up from the model, you can actually generate something that's actionable based upon another heuristic. So if you ever see a person on steroids, you need to get these things straightened out. Maybe you need to put them in a sauna and get the chaperones activated so that the heat shock proteins massage their misfolded protein. Or maybe you need to get the lectins out of their diet so they glycosylate. The interesting thing about steroids, and I'll get back to the mic.
You can take it off.
about steroids is that steroids, that's the only thing steroids do. So we know steroids do this, and we know this is caused by that. So if we have steroids, we should do that. Okay? Simple thing. But you can see how powerful that is. Right? If you got steroids in the patient, they're getting a disease. I'm not even naming the disease. I'm naming the treatment and saying this. If you've got a treatment like this, this is what you do. So if you look at the generative paradigm, our philosophy should be rooted in heuristics and models that work in practice, not only in principle. Here's another one. If you over-anticipate the needs of a complex system, you risk increasing its fragility. Or in the words of my father, sometimes too much good is no good. Okay? Now what does that look like? Do you give everybody a multivitamin? If you anticipate the needs of a complex system, you risk increasing its fragility. And what do we define fragility as? The capacity to be disrupted easily. Okay, like the electrical system. Okay? So, it's like this. I come over your house, I do your math homework. I come over the next day, I do your math homework. I come over the next day, I do your math homework. And guess who has to take the Regents exam? Not me. You. Okay? So anytime you do something that is too good, you risk increasing the fragility of the patient. Okay? Now, that's kind of simple. And really, it comes at odds a little bit philosophical with us because we want to do good. We want to do you should take some vitamin C. You should take some B complex. But the problem is that you have to find and you have to engineer those circumstances to be that should be the appropriate thing, or you risk making the system fragile. Okay? Sometimes in a system that's not fragile, more robust, you can get away with it. And there are actually systems that are called anti-fragile that when you perturb them, they get better. Okay? So you've got a lot of ways of looking at networks, and all networks behave this way. Here's another one. If the system is over-optimized or stalled, it'll probably benefit from some noise and disruption. Okay? If the system is stuck, it is a good idea to disrupt it. Okay, what's a stuck system? How many people remember Happy Days? The show Happy Days? 2 or 3, yeah? Good. Okay, there was a guy named DeFonz. He now sells reverse mortgages. But before his career with reverse mortgages, he was DeFonz. Okay? And he would go into the malt shop, and the record player was there, and it would spin around. And every time he would just bang on it, and it would start playing. Now, how many of you are old enough to remember when your grandfather did that to the TV set? Okay? Sometimes when things are stuck, it's a good idea to bang on them. Okay, that's called dithering. We dither all the time. Anytime you drop a hot towel on somebody's liver and replace it with a cold one, you're dithering. Okay? That resolves what's called ratchet error. Ratchet error is when your clock gears get stuck in such a way. It might be an enzyme, or it might be a hormone. Something in the clock mechanism is stuck. And the best way to take care of that is to do this. Okay? So when a system is stuck, you dither it, you disrupt it. On the other side of the coin is a system that's fragile or noisy will sometimes benefit from a whisper. Here's a perfect example of this. You know, considering that like 99% of this audience is from Bridgeport, I'm sure you're just like, oh, he's telling that story again. But the reality is, it's a good story worth telling. When my kids were small, so this is about 20 years ago, we were in the Stanford Mall. It's down maybe 10 miles over there. And like most malls, there's a large department store on one end and a large department store on the other. And I had to go to JCPenney because I had to buy some guy thing, hardware stock or something. And my wife and my kids went to the Macy's because they were going to look for school clothes or whatever. So there I am at one end of the mall, coming out of the JCPenney, and my wife is coming out of the Macy's. We're separated by the entire Stanford Mall, and I can hear my wife talking to my daughters. Okay? Sometimes signals get better if they're in the midst of noise. That's called simulated annealing. Okay? So what does this say to a homeopathic patient? that people who are noisy or fragile, you can whisper to them, and they may hear it. So subtle forces are much better in noisy systems or fragile systems. Here's another one. Respect the small world phenomenon. This is a stupid game you play where you name a movie, and then somebody within 5 movies gives you a movie with Kevin Bacon. It's a very old, bad, stale joke. It was The Small World of Kevin Bacon. So you name a movie, and then the challenge is within 4 or 5 movies to find the movie with Kevin Bacon. It's inevitable that you will find a movie with Kevin Bacon. It's very hard to not. And it turns out I think Rod Steiger is even better. But the reality is that you're exhibiting what's called the small world phenomenon. The small world phenomenon is things are much more connected than you think. All right? They estimate that any molecule in your body can get to any other molecule in your body via a maximum of 3 to 4 steps. So think about this when you engineer a blockade. Okay? I had a patient recently with melanoma. They put him on what's called a BRAF inhibitor. And the guy was great for a month or 2. And then completely rerouted. In other words, they played the game of Kevin Bacon on his melanoma. Within 2 to 4 months, he had engineered the small world phenomenon and gotten around things. So blockades, single actions, unitary types of things, you always will have this small world effect. So things have to be given in that kind of, what did I say before, requisite variety type polypharmacy? Here's another one. Maybe you think this, maybe you don't. Most chronic disease will settle into some form of suboptimal coexistence with its host. You'll find most people who are chronically ill have adjusted and made a deal with their illness. Okay, maybe not a psychic deal. They made a biochemical, a genomic, they made a phenotypic deal with the illness because it was guaranteed, even though suboptimal, it was guaranteed to let them go on. And that's called generative entrenchment. And the best example of that was the VHS cassette, another thing that dates me. But back when people watched movies on cassette tape, the format was called VHS. But the cassette tape was invented by Sony, and they had a format called the Betamax. And the Betamax was a better quality tape than the VHS. But Sony wanted to hold on to the rights to the Betamax, and so Samsung and all those other guys said, well, we're going to go grab this format. Doesn't matter that it's not as good. It's one that we can use. And so what became the de facto standard was not the best video. The thing we watched for a decade was not the highest quality video that was available. So systems routinely settle into these entrenched modes. And these are very difficult to change because the system is more or less kind of made a deal with things. It's like, somebody who's made a deal with somebody who's like having a fight with their next door neighbor, but you really feel that the neighbor's wrong and they're right, and you tell them, you really should fight this in court. You say, I figured it out, we're going to get along with each other. So they settle for the suboptimal solution, even though they might have had something better. This is another one. If the disease has a name, it has a neighborhood. A pathway modeling is reductionist. It doesn't take into account information. But the other thing about it is that diseases cluster into what are known as subgraphs. So, for instance, when one thing starts to activate as part of a pathology, it will start to take other things out with it. And that is why, despite our best naturopathic philosophy, and despite our understanding that each person is different, and despite our understanding of functional relationships, they can write pathology books. Because even though everyone's different, lupus tends to have a certain characteristic appearance to it. It might be different, it might be varying in severity, but it's going to look kind of like what the textbook says. And that's because as these diseases start to produce their interactions, they start to cluster into these subgraphs. And so most types of disease subgraphs are where you want to sort of do the work when it comes to engineering those types of interactions, those types of therapeutics. And this is really great because I think what I've kind of done here is tell you about a 30-year-old love affair with the Vis Medicatrix that I've had. And I've kind of looked and searched for this thing. I've looked under rocks. I've looked on top of trees. I went everywhere in search of it. right there all along. It was just doing its thing, but I wasn't in that situation. Like Jim said, I couldn't see it. But I always, and I think, what's the difference between, see, you can describe any other profession by what it does. Chiropractors believe that adjustments do this. An osteopaths believe that there's entrapment of the spinal fluid, and so on and so forth. This is one of the only professions that can describe itself by virtue of why it does what it does. And that's a big difference, because that entitles you to say, we are a medical, healing, I don't know what the current word is, art. Okay? Because there is a difference, and I have to tell you that that difference is rapidly eroding. You've got the guys in systems biology now. Every textbook of systems biology in the initial chapters is an assault on reduction. So those guys, they're here, and before long, they're going to be trending and tracking and looking at things, and they're not going to call it disease, they're not going to call it vital force, they're not going to call it any of that stuff. They're going to call it something else. And I've been around in this profession long enough to see innumerable elements of our legacy basically just sloughed off of us and never got credit, even for coming up with it, let alone the fact that we didn't defend it against the people who took it away from us. Anyway, the COE, we use these principles to reinvent the office call. Okay? What do you do an office call with? You do it with a soap form, right? What good is a soap form? If I can have another minute? No, I got a minute. What good is a soap form? It's a bunch of stuff with letters and words. At the COE, we turn every patient into their own network. And then we have that network interact with all the other networks of every other patient. So all we're ever doing is parsing all the trends and characteristics of what we're doing. And this is stored as data. These are stored as relationships. I always tell people, what's the most important thing? This, or that, or the thing in the middle? The thing in the middle is the most important thing. It's the relationship. Okay? What in a soap form ever gives you a relationship to anything? It's a bunch of text. Okay? So we're actually, and the students love this because it also mind maps the entire process. And then we do all sorts of cool stuff with lines and things, and we make waves and curves. And, what we try to do is get a little close enough to get the V's into the picture. Okay? And be close enough, a heuristic. Get close enough to get the V's into the picture. These are the people I'd like to acknowledge in no particular order. And I'm done.